Hello everyone, this is Ashish again, and this is the next lesson in the Azure Bicep training series. And in this lesson, we are going to talk about what exactly Azure Bicep is. So, if we quickly go into the course outline, and so in the first session, we actually discussed about the entire course outline, what are the things that we are going to cover, including the first lesson, which is what is infrastructure as code. So in the first lesson, we have discussed what exactly infrastructure as code is, what this paradigm is, and why it's getting so much popular in the infrastructure or the cloud native world. The next lesson that we have in this particular course is what is Azure Bicep, which is the topic for today discussion. And then going forward, we will be discussing about the next lesson in upcoming weeks. So if you do not have the idea about what are the different lessons we are going to cover, you can watch my previous session. The last session that I did, and you can see all the topic that we are going to cover in this training. So without wasting further time, let's discuss about what is Azure Bicep. So before we get into the Azure Bicep, we will quickly go into this discussion again, and we will not really, go deep dive into the infrastructure as code, the whole thing for maybe 30 minutes or 40 minutes. So we will just quickly go around the same thing, and then we will discuss about this on this particular slide. So the first thing the infrastructure as code which emphasize upon is that declarative versus imperative code. So there are two types of code that you can write, and either of them, all the tools that you see in today's world, they fall into either of them. Either they are declarative or imperative. And when we talk about Azure, then Azure Bicep is one of them. And Azure Bicep is of course declarative in nature. We will quickly see what exactly declarative and imperative is. Let me show my screen. Okay. So I will just quickly show you a snippet here. It is just an example here. And if you can see, it's a PowerShell file. And if you see, we don't really get into the details of PowerShell, but I will try to emphasize upon the declarative and imperative nature of it. So PowerShell in script is imperative in nature. So what do we mean by imperative in nature is that PowerShell runs this file line by line. So if you can see, this particular PowerShell is creating a virtual machine essentially in the end. So if you see, this is a new azvm commandlet here. But before that, we are creating a couple of things that you can see. We are creating config, we are creating virtual machine configuration. So a lot of variables here, and then using those values, we are creating different resource component that we are going to use. For example, NIC card, public IP, VNet, subnet, and all these things we are creating. And then in the end, we are using one of the virtual machine configuration by creating this VM using this commandlet. Now, imperative means that all these command will run in sequence, and you have to make sure that if something happens on this particular line 31, so for example, while creating your VNet subnet, if due to some reason it could not work, how it will work, you have to make sure that it has to have a virtual network, and what would, if that already exists, that virtual network, or if not, then how will you create those virtual network. Or similarly, if you create a NIC card, how are you creating that NIC card, and how are you attaching that subnets to the NIC card. If that subnet is not created, how will this NIC card will work. So, or if you somehow cut this and paste it here. So if you create the NIC card before creating the subnet, and the PowerShell runs this, in imperative way, that is procedural way. So line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it will try to create a nick card before it has this subnet, and PowerShell does not have any idea that you are creating the subnet here. So it will, before creating the subnet, it will try to create a nick card, and it will fail, because and you have to kind of write the logic to evaluate whether the subnet is available or not. So that logic, that understanding, that intelligence you have to write. So it's the PowerShell itself does not have any kind of logic or any kind of intelligence to know what resources supposed to be created before doing something, and it is very procedural in nature, that it will go in sequence, and then if something, if you miss one order with the another, then your PowerShell is not going to work. So you have to make sure that this thing is working. And then it may look like a simple thing right now for a virtual machine, but as and when you start growing your infrastructure, so you don't really end up with the one virtual machine. You may have a couple of virtual machine, couple of virtual network, couple of storage account, and then you have to have some associated in resources, like maybe a web app, maybe a Kubernetes cluster, maybe something else. All those things, how dependencies, and when to create what, and then how they are related to each other, you have to kind of write those logic, what if else, all those conditions, logical conditions and all. However, if we talk about declarative code, so far we have been talking about imperative thing. Now we will talk about declarative, which is Azure, Azure Bicep is. So Azure Bicep, sorry, yeah. So Azure Bicep is declarative in nature. Anyway, so it's declarative. So how it is declarative? Now let's go back to the Visual Studio again, and now I will open a bicep file, which again creates a virtual machine. Now this might look like a little bit too early to discuss about bicep file, so we'll not get into the structure, like what exactly this is. As you can see, it's a parameter, params, or the parameter, but we have a dedicated, we will be having a dedicated lesson for understanding the structure of bicep file. Right now what our purpose is to understand the bicep file, and if you see, we are kind of defining those values in a similar way. But when we want to, so all these values are being defined here, there are some variables, there are some parameters, and what the difference is between them, we are going to talk about it in upcoming sessions, and when to use what and all those things. But right now the major point of discussion here is that, if you see, when I'm creating a public IP, I'm just telling what needs to be, the thing. So I'm creating a public IP. Then similarly, I'm creating a network security group. So if you are familiar with the virtual network concept in Azure, then you have to have a network security group to kind of have a kind of a firewall type of logic for your virtual machine or for your networks. And then similarly, we have this virtual network, then we have this NIC card, and then we have this VM. Now, if at all I will do the similar kind of thing here, instead of creating VM in the end, if I do this here, it will still work. So even because when I'm creating a VM, I am referencing, let me go there and let me show you. So when I'm creating the VM, I am definitely referencing this NIC ID. Now NIC ID is coming from the NIC card, which is in the bottom. So before even creating the NIC, I'm kind of referencing it. Bicep knows that, and Bicep will not create this resource, will not go and create this resource before the references are created. So reference is this. So nick will be first created, and then again for nick to be created, it is referencing something called subnet ref. And now the subnet ref is here, and this is coming from the virtual network, and this virtual network name is coming from this, and then virtual network is somewhere this, and which is before nick. So before even creating virtual network, I can't create a nick, but all this sequence dependencies will be covered by Bicep, and it will be able to create those resources without you having to write those complex logic. However, if you go with the PowerShell, all those sequence you have to maintain, and that's what the declarative nature of this infrastructure is. So you just tell what needs to be done. So you need a VM with this name, with this location, with these properties, all this, and then Bicep will take this definition, and the Bicep engine will instruct Azure Resource Manager to create these resources with so and so declared values. And that's what the difference between Azure Bicep and not essentially Azure Bicep, but declarative and imperative. Now, having said that, now let's go back to the discussion here, and we will talk about the other things that we have on the slide. Desired state configuration, we already have mentioned this. So desired state configuration is that similarly declare. So when you declare something, then you essentially mention what exactly the desired state you want, and then when you tell this is the desired state I want, you actually tell the property, and that's it. The Azure Bicep engine behind the scene, or whatever desired state tool that you use, will make sure that it works as intended. Immutable infrastructure. So immutable infrastructure is, check, just give me a moment. Yeah, so immutable infrastructure. So immutable infrastructure is that when you create a infrastructure using Azure Bicep or any any infrastructure as code which are desired state configuration tool, you are sure that you're sure that if this works once, then it will always work. That's how and then when you want an immutable infrastructure intends to say that if something needs to be changed, you change the definition of this file and then deploy it again, instead of going into the infrastructure and changing. So for example, you deployed the virtual machine and now you want to change something in that virtual machine. For example, you want to install an extension for IIS, or you want to configure some other information, or maybe you want to change the virtual machine. For example, if you want to change the virtual machine SKU or size, so you, instead of going into the portal and changing that, you define it here and then you deploy it again. And that's how the immutable infrastructure comes into picture, that you don't change the infrastructure. Instead, you always make changes into your code, and then that code is getting deployed again. Of course, the further CI and CD comes into picture. Again, we are going to discuss about CI and CD in upcoming sessions, but for the time being, that's what the immutable infrastructure is. Now the next part is Azure Bicep or Terraform. Now all these things are pretty much relevant for any infrastructure as tool which you may know nowadays. I have listed these two tools because often we compare these two tools when we are talking about Azure. But when you are talking about any other tool, like you have many tools like Pulumi is there, then you have Puppet, you have Chef, you have many other tools. But nowadays, most of the discussions comes around these two tools, and that's why we are discussing about them. Azure Bicep or Terraform, both of these tools are very, very good what they do, in what they do. Azure Bicep is also a disaster state configuration tool, and it is declarative in nature, and it helps you to implement immutable infrastructure. Same applies to Terraform. But then which one is good for you? So Azure Bicep is, as you know, it comes from the Microsoft. So it is coming from the cloud, which coming from the same team or same company which has built this Azure cloud. So if you are Azure cloud only customer, or if you are Azure cloud primary customer, so in some way, if you have an infrastructure where Azure has a lot of influence, then it makes sense to have a look on Azure Bicep. But if you are not, if you are an organization where the cloud provider is not a I mean, there is no dominance of one cloud provider. You are a multi-cloud infrastructure organization. So you have similar set of infrastructure in Azure, and then you have more or less similar set of infrastructure in AWS or Google Cloud. Then Azure Bicep does not fit into your requirement at all, because Azure Bicep will help you to deploy infrastructure in Azure, but for other infrastructure, for example AWS or Google Cloud, you will have to rely upon something which is which is not really a tool which is very much what you call this cloud agnostic. So the tool which is cloud agnostic, so it does not depend on one of the cloud provider. So and in that sense Terraform shines well. So Terraform supports you not only the public cloud provider, but it supports many infrastructure tools where you can use in Terraform to configure those infrastructure including public cloud provider, and then you can use them. So one major difference. The second one is that and that is coming to be discussed in the next slide. So where Azure Bicep will really make sense a lot. Let's wait for that. Another one more thing here when we compare Azure Bicep or Terraform is that Azure Bicep comes from same foundation of Azure ARM template. So if you are doing infrastructure as code in Azure space, then Azure Bicep is not the first tool, and essentially it is actually evolution of the tool that is called ARM template. And actually you can actually compile Azure Bicep file or template into ARM template and vice versa. So you can decompile as well. So they name it decompile, but essentially you can convert these two infrastructure into each. I mean these two definitions or scripts or language, whatever you want to say, but you can convert ARM template into Bicep file or Bicep file into a ARM template, and that conversion gives you a flexibility where you have a lot of infrastructure already defined using ARM template. Now you want to use Azure Bicep, or because there are some benefits that we are going to talk about in next slide, you want to use them, then Azure Bicep makes sense. Because if you want to go to Terraform because of similar benefits, then it's a whole thing is quite time taking. You may have to upgrade skills for your team, and a lot of things you will have to plan. However, for Azure Bicep, it's quite easy to kind of convert the existing ARM template into Azure Bicep file. And there is no straightforward way for Terraform for the same thing. So you will have to kind of refactor the entire thing if at all you want to go to the Terraform. However, you can migrate to Azure Bicep without having so much efforts uh, comparatively. Now, what is Azure Bicep? So we have talked about what exactly infrastructure as code is, and how it fits into what are the I would say the comparison of Azure Bicep with any other popular tool, that is Terraform. Now again, we are coming to the main topic, which is what exactly the Azure Bicep is. So Azure Bicep, as defined in the Microsoft documentation, they call it like domain specific language. So it's not a programming language as such. It's not a kind of a oops or something. It does not really fall into that category of Python or Java or .NET, but it is a domain specific language. That means that it is designed for a particular domain, that is infrastructure. So it has the features, it has the things which are required to define a particular domain, which is infrastructure in Azure. So it's a DSL, it's a domain specific language, declarative in nature. So as we have seen, it's a declarative in nature. So if you see this arm template, I mean sorry, bicep, so I have been using arm template again and again. So we are going to talk about it in in upcoming session. It's the whole structure we are going to talk about, like what exactly a resource is, what these depends on, what these variables, what are parameters. These all things we'll be discussing in upcoming session. But for the time being, we are just having a glimpse of it, like how exactly it looks like. And and for the simplicity, I have one more bicep file which is comparatively simple and small. So it's again a simple bicep file which creates a storage account. uh, you know this one is not really, yeah, it's creating a simple storage account with blah blah name, and in this location with this particular SKU in this kind, and then this access tier. Very simple storage account bicep file. And then if you see here, this one is pretty little bit complex, in terms of configuration. And we are going to discuss about how to generate the simple one, and then how to proceed further to get a little bit more realistic infrastructure using Azure Bicep. So yeah, this is declarative in nature. So when you define a, a setting, you just declare it. So you declare location, you declare SKU, name is this, kind is this, property access tier is this, that's it. So then it will take care how to kind of create this infrastructure in Azure. Bicep engine knows what information I have to generate, and then provide it to the Azure Resource Manager, and then Azure Resource Manager creates this thing for you, whatever you define. It has day one support for Azure resources, including preview. So this is very important aspect of Azure Bicep, and it's really a very important aspect when you're comparing it with any other infrastructure tool like Terraform. So it has day one support for all Azure resources. So all the Azure resources which are GA as well as previews are having inherent support of Azure Bicep, because it comes from a same Azure Resource Manager tool ecosystem. So when they are building the service in Azure, it already has the support for the Azure Bicep. However, if you are using a third-party tool like Terraform, then Terraform will not have day one support for any new service, whether it is GA or preview. Possibly for GA, maybe, because almost all GA global available product, I mean services, will have some preview in past, and then during preview maybe Terraform would have taken up and then start developing the integration with Terraform code. So they might have support for GA. They might take some more time to make that support available to you, but definitely for previews they will take some time, because even Microsoft is not really making it available for everyone, then how come Terraform will be able to integrate those things into their tool and then test it properly and then can commit to you that it will work with Terraform when you want to create this service using Terraform code. So when if at all this particular point makes sense a lot to you, because you are a your team creates a lot of resources, and then you have a very much dependencies on what Azure has new things in its box, and then if you experiment a lot, your team, you have a lot of BOCs and evaluation going on, then Bicep will definitely make sense there to use instead of any other tool. Easy to read, so you can easily, so it's not really a complex programming language as such, and that's the whole intention when they started creating even ARM template. So so if you are coming from a background of Azure ARM template, I will not get into the details of it, but it was just a simple JSON file, and then slowly that JSON file start having a lot of complex scenarios, and then it was not really making sense a lot. I mean, it was not really simple or easy to read. But when they have created Azure Bicep, they means Microsoft, they have made sure that the readability of the code is very easy. So you just open the code and you can easily see what's happening here, what exactly this particular thing is doing, what exactly this particular thing is doing. So you can usually go there inside and you can see what is happening, and then you can easily update it, modify it, and then it is self documented in a way. You don't really have to kind of put a lot of training for your existing engineers to understand this particular code at least. And then you can use this for orchestration. So as you can see, it's right now we are creating a virtual machine using this ARM template, again Bicep template. ARM is on my uh, so let me do one thing. So how do you deploy this, or how do you orchestrate it? Where we will get into the details of it when we will be working on. I mean, we will be discussing upon various things how to deploy it. But I will just give a glimpse of it. Like if you have a sample Bicep file, you can easily deploy it. And how do you deploy this is very simple. That yeah, so I have this history in my Visual Studio Code. So AZ group create dash n, the group of the resource group name, and then East US. So East US is the location. So I'm actually creating a, and actually let me see if I am already logged in. So AZ account show. So you can see I am already logged into this subscription, and I can create this resource group. So I'm creating a resource group with this name. So before creating this resource group, let me go there and show you what is there in my resource group. So let me log into the, so let me show you how this deployment works, and somehow we will see the orchestration part of it. uh, so let's wait for some time. Yeah, logging into this. What orchestration we mean in the meanwhile, let me show you that. If you see here, we are creating a couple of resources here, NIC card, VM, network security group, public IP. So it will create a couple of resources when we deploy this particular template. So before we deploy this template, we have to have a resource group here. So that's what we are going to create, again using CLI. So let's close this, and if I go ahead and see all the resources that we have, then I don't have any Bicep resource group. So I'll go ahead and create this resource group here. it's creating, and now it has created. It may take a while to populate there. Let me see. So if I refresh this, yeah, so should be, no, should come soon, or maybe this way. It is there. I mean, it takes some time to show on the UI. So bicep demo 01. So yeah, as you can see, bicep demo 01, and we don't have really any resource here. We just have created this resource group. Now what we are going to do, we are going to deploy this bicep file over there. Now that, for that you have this command, and before that actually you have a very good command here, Azure deployment group what if. So what if, what it does is it will go ahead and look into this resource group, compare it with this bicep file, okay, and then we'll tell you what exactly we are going to create. So we have a session in future where we'll be discussing this thing in detail. So right now let's just go ahead and create this. So what I'm going to do is AZ deployment group create. So what it means that I'm going to create a deployment in the group, and this is the file name, this is the parameter name, and this is the group name, resource group name. So I'll just go ahead and hit on enter, and if everything is fine, then it will create a deployment in Azure. Not everything is fine actually. So if you look at it, okay, so it's saying bicep. Okay, yeah, the location is incorrect, and that's what I said. So it's ISE VM. Yeah, and the same way parameter is ISE VM parameter. Yeah, and then it will ask me something. So you see, I'm providing a parameter. Again, we are going to discuss about in detail what parameter is, but right now I will just go ahead and enter one parameter, which is, it is asking admin password, which is, you can see a lot of parameters are defined here, and why it is just asking the password, not the other things. We are going to discuss about it in upcoming sessions. So I'll just go ahead and enter something which can be acceptable. So I'm just going to add a password here and then hit on enter. So what it will go ahead and start deploying the resources in the Azure portal. So you can see it's running, and if we look at the resource group now, and if I refresh it, so you can see there is one deployment, and if I go to the deployment part of it, then you will see that it's creating a VM. And if I go to the VM, then you will see that it's creating all these resources, and it has already created. So you can think of it like orchestration is happening over here. It has created network interface, it has created network, it has created public IP, it has created the network security group. Now it is creating a IaaS resource, which is nothing but VM. And how do I know that? If you go here, each one of them have a meaning actually. So if you see NIC, VM, virtual network, all these things we are creating over here. And let's just wait this thing to finish. So you can see the VM name is IaaS, and that's why the name of the VM is IaaS. Anyway, so let's wait for this to be created, and this is what we mean when we say orchestration. So let me close this. Yeah, so you can orchestrate your resources in Azure using Azure Bicep. So right now we are creating very simple resource like virtual machine, but you can actually do the similar thing for any set of resources that you want to create as a part of a deployment. So you can create a virtual machine along with the storage account, then a data disk, then a SQL server, then a SQL Azure SQL or maybe PostgreSQL or maybe something else, container apps, whatever. I mean, whatever is needed, you can define all of these in one, one or set of bicep file. And again, we are going to talk about it, that is modularity. So you can create modules of different general things. So for example, VM is one of the standard resource that you usually create. So you can have a module for virtual machine, and we are going to talk about it, how to create a module in Azure Bicep. We will have a dedicated lesson for it, but for the time being, the intention here is that it is possible to create modules using Azure Bicep. And by modules I mean the same standard best practices that you do in any what I would say programming or tool that you create. You need to have a modular kind of structure so that you can generalize things, you can reuse certain section or certain part of the code, and that is possible with Azure Bicep. No state file. So if you are familiar with Terraform, so Terraform is does maintain a state file, and that's where this particular what if comes into the picture. So we are going to discuss about it in in upcoming session. But this what if command is nothing but it go ahead and looks at your resources in the Terraform, the Terraform, sorry, Bicep file, and then compare it with the existing infrastructure in the same resource group, and then will tell you what exactly you are going to create as part of this deployment, depending upon what you have changed in this Bicep file, if at all. We are going to discuss about in detail, but what I meant to tell that the similar kind of logic exists with Terraform as well. But for that to work, Terraform maintains a state file using which it detects the difference, and then it tells you that what is changing in the state. Here in Bicep, no need to check the state, or no need to have a state file dedicatedly to maintain the state. It directly hits the Azure Resource Manager and check the states without having to have a dedicated state file, which is a kind of a benefit, or you can say advantage, of using Azure Bicep. You don't really have to do additional thing. Similarly, you have open source. So this is again, it's an open source tool, so you can contribute to it, you can make it better, you can give feedback, you can contribute to it by adding things that you think will improve the overall system. So you can do what all the benefits that you have with open source, and you can go ahead and look into things, how things are working, and then you can really understand how Microsoft has implemented. The last point about Azure Bicep is that it decompiles JSON to Bicep. So if you have we have already discussed about this point actually, as a benefit of having Azure Bicep in comparison to Terraform. So if you have existing ARM template, that is JSON file, then you can decompile it to Bicep without much effort, and that way you can easily migrate to Azure Bicep and start having those benefits of Azure Bicep, such as modules, and other things that we are going to talk about in upcoming sessions. You can reuse the code, and then you can have benefit of different features of this particular language, and then you can also have a kind of a more easy to understand code that anyone can understand. So this is a kind of a benefit of having Azure Bicep. Having said that, this is it. I mean, this is the second lesson in this training. We are going to discuss about many other things in upcoming sessions. So we have like 17-18 lessons here. The whole course outline is there in the first video itself. You can go there, watch it, and and then you can get to know what are the different things we are going to talk in terms of Azure Bicep. Now, before ending the session, let's go ahead and look at so it has already created the resource actually. And if I go to the browser and see, then you can see this. And then if I go to the resource group, and if I go to the resource group overview tab, then you will be able to see all these VMs, and everything is as expected. And I can actually go to the VM, and log into it as it is. So you can, it's just a kind of a bit brief understanding of this tool. I would say we have not really explored all the part of it, but we have just given a very simple demo that how do you use bicep file and what exactly the major benefits you have with bicep file. With that, I think this is it, and thanks for watching. If you have any feedback, please share your feedback in the comment section, or you can contact me on LinkedIn, or you can join our Telegram group over here where we discuss various things, and you can also watch all my previous sessions on my YouTube channel. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much.